The paper that I'm about to deliver, and I'm sorry for the translators who have to, there's nothing in written, of course, is about the impact and the reception of Fra Angelico during Fra Girolamo Savonarola's pastoral tenure, so let's say from 1490 on, and during the first years, or at least the first decade, of Fra Bartolomeo's return to art. So 1504, 1513, 1514. Now, Girolamo Savonarola's criticism of church decoration inevitably triggers a more ample discussion on the state of religious painting and sculpture of his time. To summarize his convictions on this matter is really to assess the excesses and limitations of Italian art of the 15th century. In many ways, his corpus of artistic solutions, which was founded for the most part on Dominic's claustral laboratory, has been too summarily dismissed as a mere anti-humanist appendix to the evolution of the Italian Renaissance. Recently, scholars went so far to associate Savonarola's artistic tenets with Eugenio Battisti's Anti-Rinascimento, first published in 1960, a study which attempted to identify and decipher the substratum of esoteric, arcane, and even irrational stimuli that contaminated humanist and artistic discourse in the 16th century. On the contrary, taken as a whole, Savonarola's corpus of artistic literature, albeit fragmented and patchy, deserves to be canonized within the mainstream of Renaissance discourse on Italian art. Savonarola never fostered artistic archaisms, medievalisms, or even demonumentalizations. Botticelli's fin de siècle lyrical, esoterical, and intimate exploits were perhaps inspired by his millenarian preaching, but were most definitely neither Savonarolan nor Piagnone. To maintain such a proposition is to be ignorant of Fra Bartolomeo's role as artist friar at San Marco in the aftermath of the Frate's hagiological legacy. Savonarola's quest for aesthetic and iconographical simplicitas was never an endorsement of stylistic obsoletism or atavism, but an attempt to regalvanize Dominican poverty in light of contemporary artistic production. In other words, Savonarola set out to scrutinize contemporary mores through the thorough and indefatigable lens of primitive Dominican aesthetics. The proliferation of figure disoneste in churches and convents prompted Savonarola to voice acerbic criticisms against the current conduct of mendicant orders as a whole. Pursuant to the 1263 constitutions, Savonarola objected to figure curiose and with vanità, allowing only ones viewed as semplici and devote to be displayed. In addition, he also denounced the notion of artificio, especially as direct antithesis to simplicità and naturalezza. Rarity of materials and virtuosity of craftsmanship in a work of religious art should never come before the immediacy and transparency of both its function and content. Savonarola, like Dominic, disapproved of objects which distracted the brethren, whether lay or religious, from the direct pursuit of God. These be ecclesiastical trappings, religious paintings and sculptures, majestic tombs and churches, as we've seen before, and votive idols. Many of these objects simply reeked of superstition and were noxious to the reformational laboratory that he had in mind. A perfect work of art was one that advanced ethics and function as an exemplum. Another, ragazzi. Mettete d'accordo. Savonarola had openly denounced how convents displayed coat of arms rather than crucifixes. He saw these as ostensible signs of external subjugation and secular propaganda. This was true also of liturgical parements, which, like modern football jerseys, were sponsored with escutcheons and insignias of all sorts. However, worldliness and politics were slyly introduced into the convents, often under the apparent aegis of artistic patronage. Cosimo's Pater Patriae private cells and Michelozzo's classicizing architecture at San Marco were certainly exemplary cases. Savonarola never seemed to have addressed this issue directly, but his positions had never been ambiguous. In his treatise on government, written shortly before his death, he claimed that one way a tyrant was able to distract his people from his misconduct was by building and patronizing religious spaces. The decorations at San Marco hardly met the appropriate conditions of an austere and modest life. According to the 16th century Dominican historian Fra Razzi, this Florentine convent had always appeared more magnificent and sumptuous than the friars had ever desired. So menacing and far-reaching were the ramifications of ecclesiastical corruption, and so manifest and insidious the physical marks of Medician patronage at San Marco, that Savonarola considered building a brand new, quote, heavenly one in Monte Cavo near Careggi in early 1494. Savonarola laid down the fundamentals of his theory of images both as icons and as pedagogical vehicles in the Triumphus Crucis, printed in 1497. Pursuant to Basilian and Gregorian belief, he considered images in churches to be the book or the books of children, women, poor, and illiterate. However, the only book worth being read was the crucifix. The immediacy, the simplicity, the efficacy of its message, moral, physical, symbolical, and anagogical, were paramount. It is almost impossible to find a page in Savonarola's immense corpus of writing in which the crucifix is not mentioned. In the last book of his De Simplicitate Christiane Vitae, which I shall discuss briefly, shortly, he succinctly sanctioned how Christians draw great pleasure from the contemplation of the crucified Christ. Just as lascivious images channel the mind towards impious thoughts, he thought that the quote, gentle but merciful, neat crucifix should excite the viewer to the religious fervor. Several years before, Savonarola had illustrated the power of this image in his Sermones in primam divi Ioannis epistolam. He said, "But let us consider the image of the crucifix. Is there anything sweeter for our eyes to see? This image transforms our heart. What does it represent? Surely a thing that cannot be explained." Savonarola was also aware of the power that images had outside sacred milieus and how their abuse was particularly detrimental within domestic walls. His admonitions in this case were especially virulent since visual restrictions were hard to be imposed. He urged Christians to remove, quote, figure disoneste from their houses. In their stead, Savonarola urged that apart from crucifixes, terrifying pictures of heaven and hell should be displayed. This particular image was to be explained as a memento mori, a pedagogical tool for children, and a solemn reminder for adults of the inexorable coming of death. Preparation for the escaping of hell was to be done on earth. He also understood how the actual creative process was an intrinsic and crucial component of the pedagogical process itself, suggesting that children draw themselves pictures of heaven and hell. Furthermore, aware of the temporal power of the image, he insisted that one familiarize oneself with the image of death, yet not too much, lest it become void of power. Notably, images that move the senses, figure disoneste, were now substituted with images of death and eternal torment. Quote, "You should paint death in your home," Savonarola straightforwardly advised. In turn, these images greatly differed from the more placid pictures of Mary and of saints displayed in churches. To a culture greatly affected by images, Savonarola wanted to remind his flock of the constancy of sin outside the church and the possibility of redemption in the house of God via the example displayed on its walls. Logically, the most popular iconography became the crucifixion, which integrated two themes: the foremost Christian exemplum and the inexorability of death. Even the state of images in churches needed to be seriously reassessed. With the scrupulously condemning language, Savonarola accused painters of rousing scandal for having filled churches with vanities. He saw the sumptuary laws on the depiction of religious female figures. He saw that sumptuary laws on the depiction of religious female figures needed to be enforced, something that he attempted but failed to promulgate with the women of Florence themselves. Another widely known objection that the Frate raised towards painters was their constant attempt to update saintly figures by depicting them in modern dress and impersonating religious figures with real women. More than anything, he loathed the secularization or contemporarization of religious spaces and how artists reflected the changing mores of society on sacred turf. Savonarola was far from being an iconoclast. He was no Luther or Zwingli, raring to go burn all images in churches which did not narrate and ignoring and thus allowing representation of nude Venuses inside homes. Savonarola supported a moral reform of ecclesiastical and lay images and never pushed for an aesthetic or an artistic palingenesis outside canonical institutions. Countless are the passages that indicate how he fully believed in the intermediary and pedagogical nature of images. In his treatise on political philosophy, the Compendium Philosophiae Moralis, he endowed the artist with a specific role in his ideal city. Only those who corrupt the innocent in youth, as in Plato's Polis, were to be expelled. In fact, given the utter paucity of distinctive references to things artistic in the early constitution and in Dominic's hagiographies, it is debatable whether, according to the saint himself, the very possession and ostentation of art intrinsically constituted a disobedience of the vow of poverty. These ambiguities were mostly resolved by Savonarola, who, although tracing his reform back to the early Dominicans, addressed the issue of art in many instances and hardly suffered from that cultural and artistic myopia so manifest in more orthodox reformers of his time. His plan for a new convent, the one described in one of his biographies called, by the author, Pseudo Burlamacchi, to be built at Monte Cavo, was to include lay brothers who, through the production of painting and sculpture, would support and guarantee their fellow clerics the freedom to study and preach. San Marco himself enlisted a number of artists, even among the clerics, during Savonarola's pastoral term, and also encouraged the nuns from the monastery of Santa Caterina da Siena in Florence, founded by Camilla Rucellai, to practice the art of painting in miniature. Furthermore, still according to Pseudo Burlamacchi, this biographer, the frate himself was a sculptor of sorts. He is reported to have carved small doves from fig tree branches. Naturally, every inch of this work, according to the biographer, exuded simplicitas. Published in Latin in August of 1496. Because al mio tuo fate l'altra cosa. Published in Latin in 1496, and in Italian the end of October of that same year, and translated by his loyal friend Girolamo Benivieni, the De Simplicitate Christiane Vitae is perhaps the frate's most eloquent and powerful work, as well as one of the most underrated treatises of 15th century Christian humanism. The frate labored over this tract around the time of a bitter diplomatic exchange with Alexander VI Borgia, after which the chasm between Savonarola and Rome would become irreconcilable. The treatise, divided into 5 books, plus a dedication to the members of his order and a long proem, sought to isolate what, according to Savonarola, was at the core of all human experience. Quote, "The beginning of our salvation is a knowledge of God and having a good concept of good." His unequivocal contention was that only the crucifixion... His unequivocal contention, if I find page 7, yes, was that only those who look for God with simple hearts can ultimately lead virtuous lives. The De Simplicitate lucidly articulated and defended Christian doctrine during times that Savonarola felt were marked by the utter neglect and hatred of true Christian living. His most urgent issue was that most people led existences during which they either ignored this internal simplicitas or coerced the pure and vulnerable form, leading corrupt lives by means of either word, corrupt clergy, or sword, corrupt government. At times apologetic and at times closer to a manual, the De Simplicitate was conceived for a humanist and erudite reader. In a letter he sent to Ercole d'Este in 96, along with an early draft, he hoped that the Duke, once he had read the text, would espouse the life of the perfect Christian. In more than one occasion, Savonarola vilified all those preachers and scholars who chose to embellish words and thoughts and consequently ignore in their works any Christian content. Enlightened leaders and governments alike were also absorbed by this inebriating fad, forcing their subjects to be led astray by pagan festivals and carnivals. Savonarola would often juxtapose artificium to simplicitas in contrast to the written truth of scriptures and the early Christian fathers. Simplicitas was thus understood as synonymous with truth and sanctity, as means for proximity with God, and opposed to duplicities, duplicitas, and simulation, simulatio. Unlike the simulators and the duplicities, the simple ones, the simplices, made no distinction between thought and action. Simplicitas, and this will obviously connect to Fra Angelico, must be experienced internally in order to be manifested externally. Though external stimuli do cultivate this process of interiorization of faith. Book 2 and Book 3 explore this very relationship, namely how the living out of simplicity amounts to a sincere manifestation of faith. Savonarola believed that only the saints and the beatified possessed this simplicitas of the heart. He reminded his readers that despite the fact that Matthew had stipulated that the unbending requirements to enter paradise, being poor, there were plenty of wealthy holy men in the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who manifest heartfelt simplicitas. Like early Christians, their proximity to God was possible since they led simple lives and were content only with what was necessary according to the exigencies of their social status. Everything considered beyond the decorum of the status must be surrendered to the poor. However, he claimed that even saints needed to forfeit all unnecessary richness given the inexorability of temptation. The De Simplicitate became an entreaty to marry the lifestyle of early Christianity and to live out the simplicity of Christ's example. A manual which emphasized the essential and eliminated the superfluous. The 1497 and 1498 bonfire of vanities and the deployment of the youths, the fanciulli, into vice squadrons were, in this respect, the physical culmination of this pauperistic conversion inspired by this text. Medieval paupertas, essence and foundation of mendicant orders, had acquired new meaning within the context of the reformational fervor ignited by Savonarola. In light of the loss of modesty and propriety in 15th century Florence, the Frate decided to breathe new life into Dominic's moral and existential condition. His restoration of Dominican pauperism was redefined and reconstituted extra ordinis for a larger and lay audience, In a sense, the De Simplicitate is Savonarola's attempt to secularize, update, and divulge Dominic's Paupertas to a humanist and learned audience. By undressing Paupertas of its clothes of his archaic habit, he reintroduced it and fortified it and made it accessible and ready for battle under the more encompassing concept of ethical aesthetic simplicitas, of course. However, Savonarola was not altogether certain that the measures expounded in this booklet were thoroughly effective. Tribulation still seemed to be inevitable. He said, quote, at the end, "A great war shall humble all pride, and a great pestilence shall tear down all pomp and pave the way for the return of simplicity." Basically, he was trying to infer that simplicitas was not something that could be attained by humans, but you had to have a millenarian discourse to make it happen. In order to introduce this chapter on simplicia exteriora, literally simple exterior things, Savonarola embarked into a series of categorical parallels between that which is or seems natural versus that which is or seems artificial. In Book 2, Savonarola indicated how angelic substances were by definition and by extension simple. Accordingly, the simpler the being or entity, the more it partakes from God, and thus is more perfect. Likewise, he who is most affected by superfluities is most distant from perfect Christian living, and thus is most unlikely to reach God through contemplation and prayer. In Book 3, he re-elaborates this irrevocable premise. Simplicitas is what derives from nature, while artificial is all which is man-made and derives from human inventive. Having ascertained this self-evident axiom, a number of corollary assumptions on the nature and process of creation, artistic and natural alike, are then laid down by the frate. An orator is duplicitous, since his nature is hindered by his art. An artist is therefore considered too artful, artificioso, whenever he chooses not to truly imitate nature. Very catch-22 situation. Already with this assertion, he implicitly claimed that all acts of mimesis are considered incapable of being utterly imbued with simplicitas, since they, at their best, strive to imitate nature. This notion is confirmed by a contemporary sermon where Savonarola acknowledges the inevitability of cose artificiate, like houses and clothes, in the life of the true Christian, and urged that these remain as simple as possible. The creative process, too, is one step removed from simplicitas, and therefore less desirable to people precisely because it is inherently imperfect. Quote, "Simple works are works of God, while the works of art derive from the schemes of art, which are invented by our intellects. Thus, the products of art are works which immediately derive from human invention." Well known is the frate's espousal of the theory of artistic subjectivity, at times ascribed to Lorenzo de' Medici, Marsilio Ficino, Leonardo, whereby every painter paints himself according to his concetto. Unlike his eminent contemporaries, Savonarola affixed negative connotation to these terms, especially if it went beyond the boundaries of simplicitas. Rather than an assertion of physical incarnation of artistic self-consciousness, Savonarola had endowed this dictum with all the shortcomings and limits of human interiorization. Savonarola was also well aware of the mechanism of artistic production and the almost indissoluble tie between artist and patron. For this reason, he specifically tackled the problem of creation of the appropriate work according to the status, whether ecclesiastical or lay, of the individual who commissioned. Members of his order were bound by the constitutions in matters of artistic decoration. Appropriately, Savonarola had revived the profession of the lay brothers, conversi, to perform this very duty, since they were conversant with the liber consuetudinum. In the De Simplicitate, he alerted friars that perilous novelties, novità, were lurking every time these rules were ignored. Elsewhere, he urged friars to commission images that even a thief would ignore. Members of the clergy at large were reminded to only patronize good artists, buoni maestri, and to avoid distracting images, figure grosse che muovono al riso, since the true Christian only desires for images indispensable for his spiritual life. A competent artist could use his skill to elevate souls to spiritual heights. A dishonest one, on the other hand, could ultimately be a source of lies and deception. Both the secular and the regular clergy was invested with this fundamental responsibility to protect the very brethren they intended to lead, and that any kind of exuberance and excess was not to be tolerated. We go to Fra Angelico, if this will allow me to. Was it possible, then, to conceive of art that was absolutely simple and artless, according to Savonarola? Savonarola thought that children, due to their inherent naturalezza and absence of duplicitas, and the apostles, of course, due to their utter acceptance of the Holy Spirit, were those who manifested simplicitas in its purest form. They are the immaculate creators, he called them. It is inferred, therefore, that the ideal artist, like the ideal friar or the ideal citizen, was someone who had been genuinely infused by God's grace and whose pure instinctiveness guided his artistic creations. As such, the creator becomes the vehicle through which God speaks and whose aesthetics become the crystalline expression of the mystery of the Christian truth. In this respect, an important issue was the extent to which Fra Angelico and his works were considered ideal or at least appropriate according to Savonarola's standards and contexts. The anonymous author of Savonarola's biography, which is also called La Vita Latina, an early 16th century biography, which is now at the Nazionale in Florence, claimed that the Frate of Ferrara asked his novices to remove and whitewash all things from their cells which impeded the proper pursuit of spiritual life. This was largely part of the pauperization, or in Savonarolan terms, simplification process that the convent underwent after the secession from the Lombard congregation, which was accused for many years of moral laxity. Avoiding accusation of simony, Savonarola had asked his superiors permission to donate all objects whenever these included affezione. These were figure di santi and other precious books and vestments. It is not clear what works the Frate had sought to expunge. At the time, many veteran friars at San Marco were recalcitrant about giving up the convent's precious links with the Medicean past, or the splendor of the Medicean past. Notably, however, Fra Angelico's pictures in the cells were not cover over, since not only they were not superfluous and distracting, but incarnated St. Dominic's spiritual and aesthetic austerity that Savonarola himself sought to restore. Already before Savonarola's first sojourn at San Marco, Fra Angelico was known as working within the confines of the very constitutional stipulations which would form, along with prophecy, the Savonarola's project of conventual reform. These images served a specific didactic function, and we all know that, especially the frescoes in the novices' cells, which have been linked to the De Modo Orandi by, I think, William Hood or one of those people. Fra Angelico's artistic solutions to revive and reaffirm traditional Dominican spiritual practices could only have been well received by Savonarola, who saw Giovanni Dominici and, to a slighter extent, Antonino Pirozzi observance as precursive to his own. Savonarola did not distinguish Fra Angelico in any of his sermons and writings. There are a number of nostalgic and eulogistic references to aesthetics of the early fathers, of the early Christian fathers, which, conceptually speaking, were triggered by the same reformational spirit evoked by Pirozzi, which supported Fra Angelico's production. Other more factual elements point to a positive reception of Fra Angelico on his part, of Fra Angelico by Savonarola. Savonarola paraded in procession the linen standard which featured a meek and unadorned crucifixions on Golgotha, which Fra Angelico typologized in the convent cells. Due to its formal proximity and to a spurious Italian inscription, this work was traditionally ascribed to Fra Angelico. A recent study, however, has attributed it more safely probably to a young Francesco Botticini. Rather than destroyed, and that is the spurious sort of inscriptions, that it's not in the thing but just underneath, but it basically attributes this work to Fra Angelico. Rather than destroyed, Fra Angelico's works had been preserved and saved. Only 3 years after the Frate's death, after Savonarola's death, his followers at the convent purchased the necessary material, gold and azurite, for the restoration of St. Dominic embracing the crucifix in the cloister. About the same time, the Piagnone, the Savonarolan follower Lorenzo di Credi, modernized the San Domenico altarpiece in Fiesole by painting a landscape in architecture over the golden background. In 1515, Fra Paolino, another Piagnone, restored parts of the frescoes in the chapter room under the guidance of the then prior Fra Filippo Strozzi. Inscriptions underneath the Annunciation in St. Dominic embracing the crucifix in the North Dormitory were adding during or shortly after Savonarola's ministry. William Hood suggested that this intervention infused new meaning to these works since, quote, by Savonarola's day, the painting were regarded as illustrations or emblems rather than instruments in the liturgy of the Dominican constitutions. In other words, Savonarola kept alive and gave new life to these frescoes by exploiting him in order to pursue his conventional reform. There is also a philological concern. Terms such as devoto and semplice were constantly employed by Savonarola when addressing his own aesthetic directives. Such a lexicon was used to describe Fra Angelico and his art well before the frate's tenure. Landino, in his proem of his 1418 Commento sopra la Commedia, described Fra Angelico's style as vezzoso and devoto, graceful and devout. These typologies were in turn adopted by Antonio Billi, by the Anonimo Gaddiano and Malivecchiano, as mentioned by Gerardo, and Michelangelo. Vasari, in his final and patronizing evaluation of the artist, employed such lexicon as well: semplice, puro, sobrio, casto, umilissimo, modesto, and devoto. Let us fast forward a few years and move to circa 1510, more or less. Savonarola was executed at Piazza della Signoria on the 23rd of May of 1498. We all know that. Even after his death, San Marco and its friars continued to be pressured and closely monitored by ecclesiastical authorities. A gradual and coerced transformation took place among the conservative branch of this movement, of the Savonarolans, in the first 2 decades of the 16th century. Unlike the more dissident Piagnoni or the more dissident Savonarolans, who were openly against church authority and dwelled outside its legal confines, the great majority of friars in the convents of the Tusco-Roman congregation, the congregation that was born after Savonarola's tenure, had to comply with and respect ecclesiastical hierarchy and maintain a substantially low profile in order to survive. Among these friars was Fra Bartolomeo dalla Porta, who, according to Vasari, picked up his brushes after being inoperative for about 4 years, which is not true, probably. For more than a decade, this painter was effectively the artistic voice of Savonarola's Reformational headquarters and, as Dominican sources confirmed, served as the artistic and moral model for all friars. Unlike Fra Angelico's strictly intramural works, I'm talking about the ones in San Marco, the permanent, the private, almost inaccessible frescoes in the dormitories, which sought to reinforce the inner strength of early 15th century observant friars, Fra Bartolomeo's itinerant pictures divulged San Marco's message to its constellation of convents. Savonarola had a number of convents. At the beginning there were 4, and then eventually I think there were 12, all around Tuscany and also in Umbria and in Upper Lazio. Much like Savonarola's texts and illustrations, particularly the ones that the frate himself seemed to have fashioned, these paintings also embody pure propaganda. They conveyed San Marco's rebirth and productivity, despite the severe bans issued against the frate and enforced even after his death. Most importantly, they underscored the convent's politics of normalization. Fra Angelico's religious and artistic experience at San Marco was certainly a model for the project for Fra Bartolomeo and his priors, for the project that Fra Bartolomeo and his priors intended to pursue in post-Savonarola and San Marco. Urban or even conventual legends, originated probably among Dominican circles, recalled how Fra Angelico was so filled with Christian humility and simplicity that he painted only figures that exuded saintliness. Furthermore, he prayed before picking up his brushes and never executed a crucifixion that did not induce him to tears. Fine. The epithet Beato dates from, around the beginning of the 16th century. I actually saw this thing from Federico Zeri, who found a notizia even before the usual one. Fra Bartolomeo paid homage to his predecessor by including his portrait among the saints in the Pala di Signoria, as we all think. We're not sure. His disciple, Fra Paolino del Signoraccio, went so far as to place Fra Giovanni da Fiesole next to Savonarola St. Peter Martyr on the far left, in a 1528 Sacra Conversazione for San Paolo at Pistoia. Fra Angelico proved to be more than a mere inspirational figure. He formed and cemented the artistic tradition of a religious community and in turn of an order whose aesthetic palimpsest prior to then was all but straightforward. More specifically, this painter secured and often forged the iconographic koine for the Dominican observance and provided compositional solutions which Fra Bartolomeo would aptly exploit. His appropriation of major elements Fra Bartolomeo's appropriation of major elements of Fra Angelico's corpus can be seen as a reflection of that moral continuum between the observant tradition of Giovanni Dominici, and especially Sant'Antonino, and the reformational simplicitas upheld by Savonarola. Fra Bartolomeo readapted Fra Angelico's composition of St. Peter Martyr enforcing silence in the north section of the cloister for his St. Dominic enforcing silence at the hospice of Santa Maria Maddalena in Pian di Mugnone and the same hospice in San Marco. Straightforward images. Similarly, he used Fra Angelico's Christ received by two Dominicans for his Christ and the pilgrims to the road to Emmaus. Among the most recurrent iconographies in Fra Angelico's vast corpus, St. Dominic and St. Francis embracing acquired special significance after Savonarola's death. Jordan of Saxony related how skirmishes between the two Dominican orders began at the very early stages. During the 1234 General Chapter, the same year Guzman was canonized, Dominicans agreed to set up some kind of a tribunal specifically designated to resolve the persistent disagreements with the Franciscan, especially in matters of theology and papiristic foundations. This antagonism, and I'm sure the Dominicans here can confirm, surely proved to be fierce. The origin of this subject derives from the Legenda Aurea, we think. According to the Dominican Bishop of Genoa, Jacopo da Voragine, Dominic, while waiting for the approval of his order in Rome, had a vision of Christ eager to destroy a corrupt world, and of Mary interceding for humanity, representing both Dominic and Francis, to him as solutions to scourge of Dominic and Francis, to him as solutions to scourge of pride and avarice. Dominic, who had never seen Francis before, recognized him in a church on the following day, embracing and kissing each other. They swore unity and harmony in the eyes of God. Sure. A remarkable example of this subject, and this is going back to Fra Bartolomeo, is in the chapter room of San Domenico Imperato. Here, the union of the two saints is overseen by an angel. Fra Bartolomeo, who took the habit in this convent, made a small drawing of this very fresco, adapting it into an elegant medallion form. But his concern for this topos was certainly more widespread and involved both public and private images. This pair was initially intended to be at the foot of the picture that later became the mystic marriage of St. Catherine of Siena and Saints, 1511. The altarpiece depicting this archetypal Dominican iconography, Fra Bartolomeo had painted a number of St. Catherines, was originally placed in the church at San Marco. The then Gonfaloniere a Vita, Piero Soderini, bought it shortly after and donated to the French ambassador and bishop of Autun, Jacques Courreau. At some point in the making of this picture, the saints were transferred from the immediate foreground to the less conspicuous background and were substituted with St. Catherine, thus altering the theme and objective of this Sacra Conversazione. Fra Bartolomeo devoted specific attention to this iconography years later, when he included the subject in the courtyard of the hospice of Pian di Mugnone. In this case, the fresco was not only located in a secluded setting of the convent, but also in a site generally restricted to laity and other clergy. The two Dominican artists, Angelico and Fra Bartolomeo, endowed this embrace or encounter between the two founders of the Dominican orders with different meanings. For Fra Angelico, this theme still represented the affirmation of unity among rival papiristic experiences, especially in the precarious years between the Avignonese captivity and the capture of Constantinople. In the case of Fra Bartolomeo, the issue touched closer to home. The perennial conflict caused by centuries of uncomfortable cohabitation had reached bitter peaks during Savonarola's last years. Savonarola's first major public detractor was the observant Franciscan Fra Domenico da Ponzo, who in 1495 challenged the veracity of his prophetic message and therefore the very basis of his reformational project. Even more vicious were the attacks of another Franciscan observant, Fra Samuele Cascini. His 1497 De modo discernendi falsum prophetam a vero prophetam placed Savonarola for the first time in the schismatic and heretic map. Tempers irrevocably flared during the 7th of April of 1498, Prova del Fuoco, or trial by fire, which is not this one. The convents of Santa Croce and San Salvatore al Monte soon after were on the path of war with San Marco. Benedetto Luschino, is a biographer also, 1518 Vulnera Diligentis, not only described the vicissitudes of this incident of the trial by fire, but also synthesized the Franciscan hostility towards Savonarola. Through Agricola, one of the characters of this dialogue, Luschino claimed that the Franciscan Fra Francesco di Puglia was a puppet of the Signoria, and his invectives contributed to bring the frate to his own demise. So successful was this friar and his order in incriminating Savonarola that Alexander VI himself had issued briefs, one in 1498, praising them for their services. Their involvement in this matter also is testified, but is considered to be the principal iconography of Savonarola's martyrdom, the execution of Savonarola and his companions in Piazza della Signoria. In the lower right, we see Dominicans and Franciscans debating, while the three friars are led towards a pyre and successfully hanged. In this light, Fra Bartolomeo's adaptation of St. Dominic and St. Francis embracing in church and conventual settings acquired a more specific resonance. It certainly aimed to address the issues pertaining to the two orders. The altarpiece, originally intended for San Marco, the one that's supposed to have shown the two in front, was a public attempt of reconciliation, especially with skeptic Franciscans. The frescoes at the hospice was a reminder or pacifier for Dominicans who still had an axe to grind with their fellow mendicants. This was part of San Marco's strategies towards normalization, or a politics of reparation and rapprochement with the political and ecclesiastical institutions ousted during Savonarola's isolationism. At this time, even the more conservative Piagnoni were solely preoccupied with the survival of San Marco, rather than with the realization of Savonarola's conventual and ecclesiastical renovation. In conclusion, it goes without saying, tacitly, that Savonarola, or implicitly, approved of Fra Angelico's artistic production in the convent of San Marco. Albeit an inappropriate locus for his project of papiristic reform, the cells of his friars were in perfect alignment with the tenets of the observant tradition he sought to enforce. Marilena can confirm today, I think, that during Savonarola's pastoral tenure, there was little added to the decoration of San Marco during those 10 years. It should be said that Savonarola did include in one of his bonfires works by Fra Angelico. So he was not completely bought. I mean, he did not say that Fra Angelico was absolutely, a beato. There were works of Fra Angelico in one of the bonfires. Furthermore, I'm not sure, and perhaps even I think Gerardo can agree, that the frate from Ferrara would have not approved of the frescoes of the Cappella Nicolina at the Vatican, since these were imbued with a lavish and perhaps ostentatious majestas papalis, which Savonarola so severely denounced in his sermons and treatises. Let us not forget that Savonarola's earliest invectives against Rome and the Church date back to his early years in Ferrara, so circa 1470s, and that these continued all throughout his life. Also, another thing, and it reminded me when I saw it, that Savonarola would have disagreed, was the tomb of Fra Angelico himself. He disapproved of tombs in churches, he disapproved of tombs of people in churches, he disapproved of monumental tombs in churches. Savonarola never wrote a treatise on his artistic theory. Fulfilling a great number of aesthetic requirements, it is perhaps not so implausible to assume, though there is no factual proof to substantiate it, that the Fra Angelico works might have provided the frate from Ferrara with reformational and religious precepts. Even more evocative would be to consider Savonarola's description of pietistic and penitent episodes as ekphrastic readings of Fra Angelico's figures, St. Dominic, Mary Magdalene, the Virgin, in the desperate grief at the foot of the crucifix. Vabbè, chi se ne frega, basta. Ci rinuncio. The most important endorsement of the Quattrocento master comes from his direct successor as friar painter at San Marco, Fra Bartolomeo. After the death of Savonarola, Fra Bartolomeo contemporized aspects of Fra Angelico's formal and iconographical lexicon and incorporated these things in his own. Fra Bartolomeo exploited Fra Angelico's solutions in order to protect San Marco's position at the time when the followers of Savonarola were still escaping virulent papal scrutiny. Finally, and now I conclude for sure, Fra Bartolomeo, at least up to 1414, that is when he went to Rome, and from which he came back in a very discombobulated form, having seen Michelangelo's Sistina, at least until that moment, he perpetuated the direct line of the Dominican observant reform in Florence that germinated, that grew, that in its embryonic form in Giovanni Domenici's pauperistic discourse, which was incarnated in, and perhaps even codified, in Fra Angelico's pictorial production, and which was finally ignited by Savonarola's fulminations. Thank you.